The restaurant was silent. Not the normal kind of silence where people quietly eat their meals. This silence felt heavy. The kind that makes everyone stop moving. Waiters stood frozen beside tables. Executives stared at the floor. Even the piano player near the window had stopped touching the keys. At the center of the room stood an old mechanic in faded blue coveralls, holding a tiny metal spring in his rough hands. And across from him stood billionaire CEO Richard Hensley. Just 1 hour earlier, Richard had laughed directly in the man's face. A $12 fix. The CEO mocked loudly enough for everyone to hear. Don't be ridiculous. But now, after spending $700,000 trying to solve the same problem, Richard's luxury company was collapsing in front of him. And the only person who could save it was the man he had humiliated. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe to Kindness Unlimited, like this video, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Stories like this remind us that kindness costs nothing, but pride can cost everything. Richard Hensley was known across America as a genius businessman. At 48 years old, he owned one of the largest luxury transportation companies in the country. Private helicopters, limousines, executive jets, his company handled them all. But Richard had a reputation. He respected money more than people. Employees feared him. Drivers avoided eye contact around him. Mechanics rarely lasted longer than a few months under his leadership. To Richard, kindness was weakness. One rainy Thursday evening, Richard arrived at a luxury hotel in Chicago for a meeting with investors. But there was one major problem. His custom-armored limousine suddenly refused to start. The vehicle was worth nearly $2 million. Security teams surrounded it nervously while executives whispered in panic. The investors were already waiting upstairs. Richard exploded with anger. "I pay millions for this vehicle," he shouted. "Why isn't it moving?" 3 company mechanics tried everything. They connected computers, opened panels, checked the battery, and replaced expensive parts. Nothing worked. Hours passed. Finally, one of the hotel workers quietly spoke up. "There's an older mechanic nearby," the young valet said carefully. "People say he can fix almost anything." Richard rolled his eyes. At this point, bring me anyone. 30 minutes later, an old pickup truck pulled into the hotel parking lot. Out stepped a thin gray-haired man named Walter Brooks. His clothes were stained with grease. His boots looked 20 years old. He carried a small metal toolbox with scratches all over it. Richard immediately frowned. "This is your miracle worker?" he asked sarcastically. Walter ignored the insult. He simply walked toward the limousine and gently placed his hand on the hood, listening carefully. Then he crouched beside the engine for less than 2 minutes. Without saying much, Walter removed a tiny spring from a hidden compartment. He cleaned it with a cloth, adjusted it slightly, and placed it back. The limousine started instantly. The engine purred smoothly like nothing had ever happened. Everyone in the parking lot stared in disbelief. Walter quietly closed his toolbox. "That should do it," he said softly. One of Richard's assistants asked, "How much do we owe you?" Walter shrugged. $12 for the spring. Several people smiled in relief. But Richard laughed loudly. "A $12 fix? Don't be ridiculous," he mocked. "You touched the car for 2 minutes." Walter remained calm. "You're not paying for the 2 minutes," he replied gently. "You're paying for the 40 years it took me to know which spring mattered." The parking lot grew quiet. But Richard smirked. "You mechanics always exaggerate your importance." Then he pulled out a $100 bill and tossed it onto the wet pavement near Walter's feet. "Take it and move along." Everyone looked uncomfortable. Walter stared at the soaked bill for a long moment but didn't pick it up. Instead, he quietly closed his toolbox. "I hope you never learn this lesson the hard way," he said. Then he walked back to his pickup truck and drove away into the rain. Richard scoffed and headed upstairs to his investor meeting. But the next morning, disaster struck. The limousine failed again. Except this time, it wouldn't start at all. The company's entire security system connected to the vehicle also shut down. Important transportation schedules crashed. Digital locks malfunctioned. Executive routes were cancelled. Within hours, the company was losing thousands of dollars every minute. Richard hired specialists from 3 different states. They replaced major systems. Nothing worked. He flew in luxury automotive engineers from Germany. Still nothing. For 6 painful weeks, the company bled money. By the time the repairs, delays, cancelled contracts, and emergency services were totaled, Richard had lost nearly $700,000. And still, nobody could fix the problem. One exhausted engineer finally admitted something embarrassing. "There's a small manual component somewhere affecting the entire system," he confessed. "Whoever understood it before, understood this vehicle better than any of us." Richard immediately thought of Walter. But pride is expensive. For 2 more days, Richard refused to call him. Then the company lost another massive client. That night, Richard sat alone in his office staring at the city lights outside his window. For the first time in years, he remembered his father. His father had been a factory worker, a kind man who fixed broken things for neighbors without charging them. Richard suddenly remembered something his father used to say when he was young: "Never look down on honest hands." Richard closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he felt ashamed. The next morning, he drove himself to Walter's small repair shop on the edge of town. The building looked old and simple. No fancy signs. No luxury office. Just tools, oil stains, and years of hard work. Walter was repairing an old delivery truck when Richard arrived. The billionaire stood awkwardly beside him. "I owe you an apology," Richard said quietly. Walter kept working silently. Richard swallowed hard. "I embarrassed you, and I acted like your knowledge had no value." Walter slowly wiped his hands with a cloth. "You weren't the first rich man to think that," he said calmly. Richard nodded. "But I want to be the last." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Richard surprised himself. "I'm sorry," he said again, this time sincerely. Walter studied his face carefully. And then something softened in the old mechanic's eyes. "Kindness matters most when someone doesn't deserve it," Walter replied. An hour later, Walter arrived at the company garage. Hundreds of employees watched nervously as he opened the limousine's engine again. This time, he found the problem almost immediately. One tiny damaged connector. A piece worth less than $20. Walter replaced it carefully. The entire system roared back to life. Lights flashed on. Screens restarted. Engines activated. The whole garage erupted into applause. But Richard didn't clap. Instead, he quietly walked over and handed Walter an envelope. Inside was a check for $700,000. Walter stared at it in shock. Richard smiled humbly. "This isn't payment for the part," he said softly. "It's payment for the lesson." Walter looked around at the employees watching nearby. Then he handed the check back. "Keep most of it," he said. "Use it to pay your workers better." Richard looked stunned. Walter smiled gently. "People are not machines," he said. "Take care of them, and they'll keep your world running." That day changed Richard Hensley forever. Employees slowly noticed the difference. He stopped yelling at workers. He learned their names. He listened more. He even started a scholarship program for trade schools in honor of mechanics like Walter. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness repair the biggest broken places inside people. And sometimes the most valuable people in the room are the ones nobody notices at first. So if this story touched your heart, remember this. Never underestimate humble people. Never mock honest work. And never forget that kindness can fix things money never will. Because in the end, respect is worth far more than pride.